singer-songwriter, I forget, somewhere in that southeastern U.S. Kind of sad music a lot of the time. We're going to start to watch that style. You're going to get that tragedy throughout, like, just the...
Okay, it looks like we are just about ready to go. Is that okay, Cynthia?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the clock is ticking.
I just wish it was further.
That was it, all right.
Shepherding.
So one announcement before I get started, which is my friend Ernest is filming this in virtual reality. So that's a 360 degree. So if we catch you like texting during my talk, just saying, okay? No, but anyway, I'm grateful to, first of all, Cynthia, Neil, all the Ruts, AJ family for inviting us for this awesome celebration. Now I'm going to plunge in.
Yeah.
So imagine yourself getting yelled at and smacked because you want to learn how to read. Would that motivate you to read more or less? And if you knew that your self-worth and your liberty depended on your ability to read, to write, and to fight, how would that affect you? In the next 50 minutes, you're going to learn why Fredrick Douglass, as a self-made man, can inspire us in our defense of liberty. The road to freedom has 3 stops today. First one is individualism. Second one is constitutionalism. And the third is rights. Let's start with individualism. Come with me back in time, almost 200 years ago, in chilly Baltimore, 1826. A little 8-year-old boy named Fredrick, who never saw his white father and would never again see his black slave mother. He meets his new slave masters, Hugh and Sophia Aud. And little Fredrick is curious, and he asks, Miss Sophia, can you teach me how to read? And she says, sure, Fredrick. Let's read the Bible. In the beginning. And he tries, in the beginning, and her husband bursts in and says, what are you doing? Don't you know that literacy will ruin a slave? He'll long for freedom and want to run away. Literacy will ruin a slave, which means illiteracy. Dumbing down people makes them much easier to rule. Anyone see a relation with what's happening in today's government schools? So little Fredrick kept reading by candlelight in secret. And after around 7 or 8 years, Hugh Auld says to his brother Thomas, you take him now. I'm kind of done with him. Thomas Auld didn't treat Fredrick that well, as if no slave master really treats their slave that well, but he would work him hard and then nearly starve him to death. Remember when you were like 15, 16 years old, how hungry you would get, how much energy you would burn, and then you'd always be hungry? Well, that's what Thomas was, that's what Fredrick was. And every once in a while, he'd sneak into the pantry and steal some food just to feed himself. But he also stopped calling Thomas master. And this was too much. So Thomas sent him to Edward Covey, who was known for breaking the spirit of slaves. He wanted to destroy their individuality and make them obedient. What he would do is he would whip and bludgeon and beat Fredrick if he did something too well, too poorly, or for no reason at all. And after 6 months of this constant terror, Fredrick his spirit was almost broken. He said that my intellect languished, the cheerful spark in my eye, these are Fredrick Douglass's eyes, the cheerful spark went out, and I became not the person who I wanted to be. And one day, after a particularly severe beating, Fredrick ran all the way across Baltimore in the blazing heat, knocks on Thomas's door. Please, please take me back. I think he's going to kill me. Thomas out opens the door, just slams it right in his face, sends him back. And on this long walk back, in a hot summer's day, Fredrick looks out at the Chesapeake Bay and contemplates the worst. Then he decides, I will fight back. And the next time Edward Covey attacked Fredrick, the battle lasted for 2 hours and only ended after Fredrick choked him so much that blood went into his fingernails. That day, he earned the respect of Edward Covey, who never touched him again in his life. But more importantly, Fredrick earned his own self-respect. And over the next 3 years, he worked on the shipping docks in Baltimore. And he watched the way the sailors walked and talked and dressed. So on September 3rd, 1838, wearing a red shirt, black hat and scarf, dressed like a sailor, Fredrick gets on a train headed to New York. The conductor comes up to him and says, I'm sure you have your free papers. No, sir, I never carry my free papers when I go out to sea. Well, then you have something to prove that you are a free man. Yes, sir, I carry this paper that has the American eagle on it, and this will allow me to go anywhere in the world. Imagine having your life, your freedom, and your future in the hands of a train conductor. The conductor looks at the sheet. Pay your fare. Train arrives in New York in 4 hours. 4 hours later, Douglas touches the pavement of Manhattan. I am free. The first thing he did in his newfound freedom was change his name. He took the last name Douglas after a hero from a Walter Scott epic. Now, who deserves credit for this freedom? Well, Frederick Douglass answers that question himself. He said, I prayed for 20 years and received no answer until I prayed with my legs. In other words, I control my destiny. I am self-made. Do you control your destiny? Are you self-made? So in his newfound freedom, Douglas relocated to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is right around the Cape Cod area. But one of the things that he did was just think about this, what kind of moral character and self-esteem would it take for a man to write a letter to his former slave? That's what Douglas did. He wrote this letter to Thomas Owl. Just consider the individualist nature here. He says, Sir, I am myself, you are yourself. We are two distinct, equal persons. You are a man, and so am I. Nature does not make your existence depend upon me or mine depend upon you. We are distinct persons and are equally provided with faculties necessary to our individual existence. In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me, and in no way lessened your means of obtaining an honest living. Your faculties remained yours, and mine became useful to their rightful owner. Yeah, right? Exactly, yeah. How's that for a letter to the editor? That was published in a newspaper. So what is he saying? He's saying, you're an individual, Thomas Out, and so am I. And by the way, slaveholding is not an honest living. So as soon as he relocates up to Massachusetts, he realizes he's free of slavery, but not food and shelter. Do you think he went around asking for government handouts? No. took a job on the shipping docks of New Bedford and started earning money. And when he got his first payment for work, he said, "This was mine." That incredible joy, that incredible pride and self-esteem and self-worth just skyrocketed at that time. So his constitution in life was clearly transforming. But what did Douglass think about the U.S. Constitution? That brings us to the second point, constitutionalism. A year after he relocated to Massachusetts, he met, so now he's 21 years old, he met the leading figure in the abolitionist movement, William Lloyd Garrison, who was this devout, passionate Christian who spoke from the pulpit with this fire and brimstone. And Garrison was also a pacifist, so he didn't really like war. And he was an anarchist, so he didn't really like government either. But he did like Frederick Douglass, so he sent him out on a speaking tour across the northern states. And Douglass, it was somewhat bittersweet because he liked telling his story, but the marching orders were, you give the facts, we tell the philosophy. And after some time, people didn't believe that this man could have been a former slave. In fact, there was one person who remembered him from the Edward Covey days, said there's no way that's the same person. So in 1845, he decides to write his first book, which Garrison published, called The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. And it was an immediate bestseller. But because he named names and technically was still a slave, according to the slave states, he feared for his life. He feared the bad guys would come up from the south, kidnap him, bring him back down to the south, and do what they wanted with him. So he arranged to spend 1 year in the United Kingdom doing a speaking tour. And during this period of time, Douglass's views on the Constitution were evolving. So in the beginning, he only heard Garrison's position, which he called the Constitution an evil compact with the devil. And his view was that no union with slaveholders. He even wanted the North to break off from the Confederation, from the states. And a lot of abolitionists weren't that radical, and Douglass was one of those. So after 1 year of a successful stint in the UK, some locals collected money to send Douglass back to America to buy his freedom. So now he comes back and he relocates in Rochester, New York, which is upstate New York. Now me as a New Yorker, anything north of the Bronx we call upstate, but nevertheless, Rochester's near the Canadian border. And one of the things, talk about practicing what you preach, Douglass helped more than 400 slaves in the Underground Railroad to reach Canada so that they could become self-made. By this time, he's really, this concept of being self-made and fighting for your freedom is now like a much bigger part of who he is. So, in fact, by 1851, he's calling the Constitution a glorious legal document, a glorious legal and liberty document. So, and then he starts his own newspaper called the North Star. Anybody know that reference, what the North Star is? Mm-hmm. So it's like when sailors
It's your navigation.
That's right, it's a navigational guide and it's a beacon for liberty specifically. That was what Douglass's point was. This is a beacon and guide for liberty in the North. So people could see this and read his works from far away. Do you think Garrison was happy with this transformation? All of a sudden now this guy is putting out a competitive abolitionist newspaper. He's pro-Constitution because now Douglass thinks that the Constitution is a pro-liberty document that slaveholders themselves should fear, not the abolitionists themselves. So by the time the 1850s come, when he's calling it this glorious liberty document, the country is in an upheaval. The stage is set for the most brutal conflict in American history, the Civil War. But Douglas welcomed it, and he thought that there was one man for the job. There was one man who could live up to the ideas of the Constitution, and that was Abraham Lincoln. So I have to read it here. The opening. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. I carry this around with me. Little Odie was using it as a sword a little while ago, but this I get choked up whenever I see the Constitution. I read the Constitution, and Douglas, again, in his views evolving, he is. His point is Americans have not lived up to that ideal, but perhaps Lincoln will. Well, sure enough, that didn't play out the way Douglas wanted, which brings us to the third point in the presentation, rights. Douglas always defended whether blacks, women, anyone whose political rights were not fully used and defended. Douglas stood out. In fact, his expression was all rights for all. Now let's just take a moment. This audience probably gets this without too much explanation, but nobody defined a right better than Ayn Rand. She says a right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning freedom of action. So the opposite of a right, the worst destruction of a person's right is having them as a slave. Clearly they have no rights, and Douglas lived it. He lived this kind of life. So his point there was that this is a moral principle. And he was disappointed because when Lincoln came in as a president, he said his number one priority was not to end slavery. It was to preserve the Union. He said, if I could preserve the Union without freeing one slave, I would do it. And Douglas was bothered by this, so he gets on the train and goes to the White House to meet with the president. And he was brought in right away. Lincoln was very respectful of Douglas. And he says, Mr. President, blacks should be allowed to fight for their freedom. That's a way that they can earn their own self-worth. So to that end, they should be allowed to enlist to fight for their own freedom. And Lincoln says, thank you for coming here, Mr. Douglas, but if I let that happen, too many white soldiers would quit in outrage. And I can't let that happen. Douglas's point was that having military service in the sense of fighting for your own freedom would give blacks this opportunity to create their own character, to build themselves. And just as Douglas himself had fought back to Edward Covey and realized that that was a pivotal moment in his own character, restoring his own character, similarly, black soldiers, that would be their way, their means to that end. Now, he was too old himself to enlist. He was in his 40s by this time, but he had two sons that he did have enlist. And he would tell them, you owe it to yourself. You'll learn how to stand with confidence, with pride, and in defending your life, the self-respect that you would get is immeasurable. And sure enough, he convinced Lincoln of this idea, and that's two of his sons. Last time I gave this talk in Nashville, someone asked if the two sons survived the war, and yes, they both did. They both lived into the 20th century. So here we have this, clearly this is one of the reasons we look to him, this man who's fighting constantly for the rights, for all rights for all. How about women? What were his thoughts there? Well, in 1848, there was an event called the Seneca Falls Convention. First time there was an organized gathering in defense of women's rights. And if you know where Seneca Falls is, and you know where Rochester is, they're both upstate, as us New Yorkers call them, but they're not that far from each other, and sure enough, who was the featured speaker that they brought down? Fredrick Douglass. And he said an interesting point, because similarly, he thought if women fought in the military, that would be their way. They were just as capable of self-ownership as men. And one means to that end, he looked historically at the fact that they fought. And he says there's no, in military history, there's no more inspiring story than the war in the Netherlands, where wives fought side by side with their husbands, and sisters fought with their brothers. So again, this idea of fighting, literally fighting for your own freedom, was essential to what Douglass was all about. And he continued on over the next decade, several decades of his life, to speak out in favor of all rights for all. And February 20th, 1895, at age 77, Douglass gave a talk for a women's suffrage club, and shortly thereafter went back to his hotel and passed away, living a full life, one of the towering giants of the 19th century. Now, I give many walking tours in New York City, and I would often end in Central Park walking tours. I would end in Central Park North. It's now called Fredrick Douglass Circle, and there's this beautiful statue of him standing there. And I would tell the attendees his story and this idea of becoming self-made, and why the ideas that he upheld, whether it's individualism or constitutionalism or upholding the rights, all rights for all, we have to celebrate that. We here this day need to recognize this man as a giant. Now, Douglass is one of the many heroes that we cover, Objective Standard, that I work for. We have a podcast called The Heroes Show that I'm the co-host with Andy Bernstein every Thursday. And we covered Douglass, actually a couple of days ago, we covered Abraham Lincoln, and I mentioned the scene with Douglass. So why is he important? Why is he relevant now to us, here, right now? Why Frederick Douglass? Why this man? Well, he lived before, during, and after the American Civil War. And sadly, we are living in a new American Civil War. The problem is only one side knows it and one side is fighting it. And they are hell-bent on destroying all institutions and monuments to liberty. My own beloved New York City, they want to tear down statues of Columbus and George Washington. And they put up 3 George Floyd statues in the last year. Yeah, that is disgusting. That's why I left. That's one of the many reasons why I left. Carrie Ann and I left. There's a moral inversion going on here. And there's no doubt it's bad out there. I mean, we are grateful to the Roths for giving us this fabulous weekend, but how do we make this last? How do we make this, when we turn on the TV, we've heard it, and everything is just this dogma. It's just a juggernaut of bad news, whether it's education, media, entertainment, even sports now is pretty much ruined. And it's that one side is bent on making you submit, okay? They're bent on destroying your self-worth, your liberty. And when things look dark out there, what do? We look to heroes, such as a Douglass. That's what I do personally. I look at him reading by candlelight in secret. I see him fighting back with Edward Covey, doing things of this nature. And that's my recommendation. In conclusion, I'll say that we have the right ideas, but too often, and not, again, in a major sense, this audience is not the ideal audience for this talk. It's really the ones who don't know the value of liberty, the virtue of liberty, and how much it is being threatened. But nevertheless, we all need to go out and do what we can with whatever means we can. And Douglass stands as that beacon and guide for us. So when we see this overwhelming juggernaut towards us and opposition that's bent on destroying our freedom, as I say, I look to heroes like Douglass. And calls to action, number 1, become self-made. Before you can help anybody else, work on your character. have a rock-solid character of the type that a Douglass had. And then number two, share those ideas of liberty, individualism, constitutionalism, and rights. So how? Like what? Give me some practical steps, Robert. Like what's the context here? Well, don't cave into mob rule is one example, whether in person or on social media. Another one is if you're in academia, and even if you have a tenured job and they want to destroy your academic freedom, walk away, like my dearest Carrie Ann did. If you're in class and your teacher's shoving indoctrination down your throat, stand up, call them out. If you're on your job, in a corporate job, and they say, because you're white, you have to step forward, call out that racist policy. So take a stand, think of people like Douglass, and take that kind of action with that kind of courage that you need, because whatever we're facing, I don't think it was as bad as what this man went through in his life. I mean, he is unique. I'll just say this one, my first interaction, because for me, the reason individualism always spoke to me, I'm number 8 out of 9 kids in a poor, not poor by Russian standards, but definitely poor by American standards family, and with welfare, food stamps, and all that. But I always wanted to be an individual. I wanted to assert myself from my siblings and have my own values and whether it's my own baseball team, my own Marvel superheroes, they were mine. One time I went with my mother into Harlem and get out of the subway, and I'm holding her hand and I see the street sign. It says Fredrick Douglass Boulevard. And I thought, man, what a name, what a manly name. And I asked my mother, who is this guy? And she just looks down and says, he was one of a kind. In other words, this is an individual here. Like there's nobody like him. So the way I look at these kinds of obstacles that we, from the comfort of 21st century United States, he went through a lot more. So in conclusion, I say, be that own beacon and guide, be that North Star in your own life first, and then hopefully you can inspire others around you to fight for your freedom. Thank you. All right, I purposely kept this short because I'm a TEDx coach and they only do 18-minute talks because that's how long it takes before people fidget in their seats, and I didn't want that to happen. But a lot of time for questions, and I'll have one wrap-up before, and I will not be upset if we don't go a full 55 minutes. Yes, Henry.
That was great, and obviously a very inspiring character.
Yes.
How do you, are you familiar with critical race theory nowadays?
Yes,
Do you
I
feel
am.
that it's empowering or enabling, or what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, actually, thank you for that question. Henry's asking the word empowerment, and actually that's one reason I have optimism for the future. Tomorrow I'm going to go into more detail about this, but that is on self-development and selfishness and the relationship between the two. But I'll give a little spoiler here. Empowerment is a positive, and the victim mentality, which the left just completely counts on and assumes, that burns out after time. So now they got to get new victims, which are like illegal immigrants now that, unfortunately blacks are coming around. Fortunately, they are coming around, so they need new victims to get their policies in. And we've seen, we've seen examples, with, especially with Mariana's talk on what government, where people just depend on government, and that's what they do. They want to give you free stuff. So. But Douglass is an interesting character because some leftist, black leftist intellectuals want him for themselves. So they'll only focus on the black side of him, but they won't discuss his ideas and his independence and how pro-Constitution he was. Okay, because that's against the narrative that they are pushing. So Douglass, should there not be a major feature film with Duncan, right? About Fredrick Douglass? Does the man deserve, with like Denzel or somebody giant, now Will Smith? I mean, that's begging to be happened. And Hamilton, I saw it 10 times on Broadway. There should be a Douglas musical. Like his life is like nobody else. And we who understand liberty and the value and do not care about race, critical race theory, we care about it to the extent that this poor man was born, half white, half black, and didn't see good versions of white people. Again, here's this individualist angle where, like a century later, Malcolm X, who just condemns all white people. No, Douglas says, even though my father abandoned me, even though some slave holders are better than others. Sophia Arnold was better than her husband. Hugh was better than his brother Thomas, who was better than Colby. So the individualism is the part that's missing, I think. That's one of several parts. But critical race theory counts on, race is, so philosophically, what does that mean? Determinism. And so many people buy in and push the determinist element. Again, going to some prior talks here, where if you fight for your freedom and you want to control your own destiny and become self-made, determinism and victimhood, they cannot coexist. It's just that simple. The terms agency and empowerment, I'm glad they're coming. That's one reason I'm optimistic. I'll tell you, I am optimistic about the future, is that these terms they're cool now. Like they're in the popular vernacular, which I think is a good sign. Did I somewhat answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yes, Xavier.
Can you go into, let me rephrase this. Okay, so when the slaves were freed, his idea was, don't help them.
That's right.
Leave them the F alone.
That's right.
And Booker T was, no, we need to help them. Is that true?
Okay, Booker T was the best. Okay, so black intellectuals in American history, Booker T was actually, that's slightly, I think I know who you're thinking of though. W.B. Du Bois. Yeah, Du Bois. French. Du Bois, whatever. He was the one, Xavier, who was for that, okay? And he had the collectivist mindset. Booker T was a devotee of Douglass and saw him as the giant that he was. So, but even between, so your point though that I think is really important is that there was a split within the black movement. And in fact, they even wanted the blacks, there were militant blacks back in his era as well, and they wanted him to be the black power guy. And he's like, no, that's not, I'm the empowerment guy, going to Henry's term. And so, again, here's where Douglas stands alone. And also the racism that he faced, sadly, later in life. So he had 3 children with his first wife, and then she died, and very late in life, Douglas remarried, and it was a white woman. And even his children didn't like, all the neighbors, nobody, this was an outrage, an interracial marriage, even though he was the product of an interracial relationship. And he, staunch individualist, he's like, no, these are my principles, this is my wife, I'm standing by her, she's standing by me, and get over it, and deal with it. And so, again, that we look at moral character, from what Carrion talked about with Aristotle. This is, this point in the 19th century, there were some up there, who had that, but to me, Douglas is he is really unrepeatable. He's like nobody else in history. Follow-up question, yeah.
So I just want to end on that. Like, I know when he married his second wife,
Yeah.
even their families, like the in-laws, denounced.
Everybody denounced him, yes.
Everybody.
So he remarried, I'll just repeat. So he remarried, and right, on her side, on his side, everybody just denounced the marriage. And again, he held his ground and continued doing what he did best, which was speaking out, living in favor of liberty and speaking out in favor of it. All right, she's got another one. Go ahead. Yeah.
So with that said, that
Yeah.
sets him up for a lot of loneliness in life. Meaning, like, sometimes, you hear the phrase, like, it's lonely at the top.
Yeah.
He was truly an American hero and an icon and so unique. And so with that said, that means also, like, who were his close friends? He must have had very few.
Not that many. Even his wife, so his wife, just so you know, met him in Baltimore, but she was free while he was a slave. So they met before he gained his freedom. But she wasn't an intellectual. She wasn't a thinker the way he was. I mean, this man was a thinker, writer, speaker, one of the top speakers in all of 19th century America. And again, people would not believe this was a former slave. He was so eloquent. And today we call him an intellectual, but I like the way Ayn Rand called the founders intellectuals who were men of action. You know, it's a combination of mind and body, thought and action. Douglass was exactly that. So the loneliness, I don't know that much about his biography, but I would think it is lonely at the top, and having a wife who is not intellectual and doesn't necessarily see the gigantic decisions that he made. He left them, by the way, when he went to England and Ireland, where he spoke to incredible audience applause. He had to leave his wife and children because they were not threatened the way he was. He was like a target. There was a target on his forehead. Anyone except Xavier have a question? Okay, thank you, though. Yes?
You said something about when the anti-slavery movement started and he made a split from...
Garrison.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was their objection to the Constitution? How did they use it the other way around?
Okay, so this is a popular... Okay, everybody hear that. So what was Garrison? Why was he so anti... The leading abolitionist in the United States, which was in the North, William Lloyd Garrison, editor and publisher of The Liberator, great title for a newspaper speaking about liberty. Why was he so anti-Constitution? Because he thought the Constitution did uphold slavery, and guess what? A lot of people to this day think that's the case. But over time, Douglass came to realize that no, it's an ideal that we're pursuing the perfect union, okay? We have not reached it in 1787 when this document was written, and 2 years later when it was ratified. So therefore, there was mixed feelings about the Constitution, so even abolitionists did not agree on its actual function and how they should denounce it or uphold it, and that was a big
Was
split.
it primarily property rights in the Constitution that they thought was
Slavery?
Yeah.
Were property rights.
Pro-slavery? Property rights?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I wonder what...
Yeah, Carrie Ann.
Somebody knows.
Yeah.
Garrison had, he called it making a deal with the devil because
Yes,
he
compact
thought
with the devil.
because if you were going to, he didn't consider the background context of the reason why even those in the North who abhorred slavery were willing to make peace with the South, to get this document signed. They were willing to tolerate the Southern slaveholding states and to form a union with them because they were worried that if they didn't do that, right, the Articles of Confederation, which was barely holding things together, they would all just be taken back over by European powers. So they were willing to hold their noses and make the deal to have some various compromises. There are like 3 or 4 big historical compromises in order to make union with them, and some of the hardcore abolitionists refused to acknowledge the Constitution because they didn't want the moral taint of being in the same country as the Southern states, and Garrison is one of those. So it wasn't the principles in the Constitution per se, but the toleration of federal legislation that, for example, allowing escaped slaves to be returned to their Southern slave
The Dred
masters.
Scott case was a big,
The Dred Scott case, exactly.
1858.
So the runaway slaves could be returned, right? They amped up the Posse Comitatus Act from 1793 in the 1850s. So there was some federal legislation tolerated to protect the existence of slavery in the South, and that's what Garrison objected to, and some other people like him.
And that is to do with property rights, I'm sure.
Uh,
I mean, I don't know if it was explicit, but
well,
that's what they're saying, is that their
court
property
cases
has
were
to be.
explicitly made about that, saying, well, you've allowed us to hold them as property, therefore
Exactly.
you must respect that we hold them as property. And so that, it was just on a collision course. I don't wanna say too much
Yeah.
more about
Okay,
filling in the
got it.
background.
Thank
Okay.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
I'll get to you in a second. So, just to clarify that, thank you, dearest, for helping me out there when I was drowning.
No, you weren't.
She's taught this stuff in college. I only have a 2-year degree in associated in electronics technology. So that's all I got. But I read a lot. That's what I have. So just to wrap this up, what Carrie Ann said was absolutely a part of it, but the idea in 1787, we're sorry, they were not ready. It was more important for the United States to be born than to destroy slavery. Hamilton, one of my favorite founders, wanted it abolished, but he knew that the South was too soon. This institution was too steeped in the culture, and so it took a civil war. It took the worst war in American history for that to end.
Got it, thanks.
Okay, yes.
I just wanted to add on to that.
Oh, yeah,
There
sure.
was no, it was on the verge of collapse and the world didn't believe that America was going to work. And
Yes.
so they kind of didn't have any time for leaning to one side or the other. And it was built off of compromises. And that's one thing that reoccurs throughout history,
Yes.
is that no one is willing to just go both ways. They all just want to go one way. But to get it to work, they had to compromise.
Yeah, which is actually on Thursday on the link. That was my point with Abraham Lincoln on the Hero Show, talking about him exactly. He had to compromise. He had people, and there's the film Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis shows Thaddeus Stevens, who was this radical abolitionist, and to him Lincoln was not good enough because he wasn't. But those kinds of people don't become successful politicians, unfortunately, and they don't get things done. There needs to be some, this is why Benjamin Franklin is a different kind of giant, because he understood diplomacy and the value of compromise in the good sense. You can't compromise on principles, especially in your own life, but when things are outside your control, such as an institution that has preceded you since human history. Okay, the thought that America can wipe out something that's existed since human history, America can wipe it out in the inception is not, that's just not looking at history or facts. Yes, Karen.
Can you fill in a little bit more of Douglas's very early life, like when he learned to read, how
Yes.
he became,
Yeah.
how he became the young man? that
How did
was
Douglas
willing to
become the young
resist?
man?
Yeah.
How he learned to write. This is fabulous. So Douglas would, when he's playing with these little white kids who were more educated, he would say, "I'll bet you I know how to spell better than you. I bet you I know how to write. I know more words than you." And they'd be like, "Get out of here." And he's like, "Okay, these are my words." And then they'd write their words and it'd fill up a whole page. And now he learned, it was like Mark Twain getting all the kids to paint, the fence. He'd get them to do the work, so now he had all these new words in his vocabulary. So he was voracious in all forms of learning. But also, again, if we go to Mariana's point earlier about innovation, and he was industrious in the sense of finding ways to do this, and always looking for, he wasn't steeped in, first of all, what they call the fixed mindset that your job as a black person is never to read. He learned, so when the quote that I have of Hugh Out saying, liberty will ruin a slave, he called that the greatest argument in favor of liberty he ever experienced. So he's 8, 9 years old, and but playing with other kids was one way. Reading newspapers. Garrison was thrown into jail in Baltimore, the place where he lived. He got access to these these abolitionist documents, because Baltimore and Maryland were slave states, but they were border states, and that's where some of the radical ideas, border states are where some of the most vicious battles take place. And Douglass knew about Garrison as being this guy thrown in jail for being an abolitionist. So little by little, the liberty movement, the abolitionist movement became part of his mindset. And then the fact that he worked and all of his money was taken away really bothered. I think they did give him like a little bit, and that's how he got the clothing, the sailor's outfit. But intellectual and physical, he, to my knowledge, like he was always talented and ambitious and curious about things. So that was how the boy became, and loved his family. I mean, in some of these letters that he writes to former slaves, like this one, it's a long letter that was published to Thomas Howard. He's asking about grandmothers and how is this one doing, because some people really treated him nicely. And again, here's the individualist angle where he doesn't blanket condemn everybody. He's like, some of these people I really cared about, and so that's a little more of his backstory. But getting kids to write words so he could copy them to extend his vocabulary, it really is amazing. Yeah. Yes.
No, Robert, I wanted to talk about your call to action about how to defend liberty, and also how to, when you see racism, speak up against it, things like that. And you see historical figures like Fredrick Douglass or Martin Luther King talk about the importance of character, and they wanted to be seen for their achievements and who they were rather than the color of their skin. But obviously we know we live in a time now of Black Lives Matter and the whole racial grievance movement, that, where it's just a complete reversal of that.
Yeah.
And just how do you deal with that? How do you even approach it? When it seems like it's such a minefield.
Yeah, I could say, at least in the job that I have with the Objective Standard Institute, I can say these things and not worry about grievance, HR taking me to task, things like that. But this is my point that I'm sorry, I should remember your name, but I can't. Dan. Thank you, Dan. I like to address people by their names. So Dan, this is what I mean by it's individual. Carrie Ann left academia, 25 years teaching, because they were threatening her academic freedom. That was a choice. That's a moral character choice. And when I do this, so even in dealing with my family, I have to say, I'm one of 9 kids, and as New Yorkers, many tilt that away, okay? And the others are very religious and tilt that away. And I speak my mind when I have an idea that it will actually be heard. But if you're going to, on social media, answer, Joe Blow at 1995, some tweet that the guy put out there, that's a lost cause. So one mind at a time is, Dan, I think one mind at a time, when you think people are worth having conversations with. Actually, I can mention Peter Boghossian. If anyone knows Peter Boghossian. So his book on having impossible conversations is excellent at this. Because his point there, definitely, if you're going to read a book, how to have impossible conversations, because he goes to epistemology. He talks to radical Muslims, hostage negotiators, and the point is, if, this is a weird thing, but facts don't matter in discussions. Because if you give your facts, they're going to give their facts. And both sides are going to dig deeper. So, but if you question their epistemology, and one example, man, I didn't know I'd be talking about this today, but he says, scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you of that? Now you're taking a step back and dealing with the way they think. It's not about, their views, it's the way they think. So that's one recommendation, and he has there are YouTube clips where he does this, and that's one way to, so your question is persuasion, and how do we persuade people effectively, especially with this avalanche where racism is the end all be all to anybody who does anything that, call them out on it. My short answer is call them out. Why does racism only count for whites? Is there something wrong with it? Don't you see something wrong with this? And why Michael Jordan and Oprah Winfrey make billions of dollars, and I don't. I'm born in America, I'm white, I don't have that much money, I'd like to. So that's, kind of roundabout way to give an answer. What time do we have? We're coming close. Yeah.
A few more minutes.
Okay, just a few more minutes. So you know what? If no one else, so I have to say a poem. Got to close with a poem. That longtime friend of mine named Robin Field, was a composer. I saw this at TOSCon a couple of years ago, and it's called The Self-Made Man. And Carrie and I would, if things were going down, well, we recited to each other whether times are good, bad, or indifferent, because we just love this poem. So I will end by saying this. He says, "You see in me a self-made man, in body and in soul. I choose throughout my whole lifespan my character and goal. I live and love by my own plan, because my will is free. I'm proud to be a self-made man, the best that I can be." Become self-made. Thank you.